Imagine opening an old box in your grandfather's attic, dated the summer of 1916. One line reads, "Please don't tell Mother what I saw here." This video is an attempt to understand what lies behind that single sentence. But the truth is stranger and harder than you'd expect. You're a young farmer in a quiet European village. You don't know the name of a single politician. You don't care about lines drawn on maps. Your life revolves around harvest season and the sound of cattle in the morning. Then, in one summer, everything changes. War is declared. And suddenly, the village that once knew you by name now knows you by a single label: the next volunteer. Why would a young man who understands nothing about politics march off to a war he doesn't understand? The answer isn't patriotism alone. British historian Joanna Bourke, who spent years studying the experience of soldiers in the First World War, documented how social pressure was a more powerful recruiting tool than any official speech. Girls handed white feathers to young men who hadn't enlisted, a silent signal meaning coward. Mothers refused to speak to their sons until they put on the uniform. The decision was never really individual. The whole village was deciding for you. You sign your name, you go home. Your mother cries, but it isn't fear alone in her tears. It's pride tangled with a terror she can't quite put into words. And you, in that moment, still believe war looks something like the stories you heard as a child. Armies meeting on a field, battles settled in a single day, heroes coming home. No one had told you yet that kind of war had already ended before yours began. At training camp, the first lesson you learn isn't how to fire a rifle, it's how to stop being an individual. Historian Paul Fussell, in his landmark study of the Great War and how it shaped collective memory, describes how training camps were designed to dismantle a soldier's personal identity and rebuild it as one part of a single machine. Your name becomes a number. Your body becomes a tool. You run until you vomit. You dig until your hands bleed. And each time, you ask yourself, is this really what makes a man ready for war? Weeks later, they tell you you're ready, but nothing actually prepares you for what's waiting. The train to the front passes through scenery that shifts gradually. Green fields, then scorched trees, then land almost without color, pockmarked with shell craters like the surface of another planet. You arrive, and the first thing that greets you isn't gunfire. It's the smell. A smell impossible to describe in one word, a mixture of wet mud, metal, smoke, and something else you don't want to name. The trench isn't shelter, it's an entirely new reality. A wall of mud 2 meters deep, braced with sandbags and rotting wooden planks. The water at the bottom never dries. Rats move freely, unafraid of people, because they've learned that here, people are too busy staying alive to chase them. An older soldier sits beside you on your first night, giving you a look every veteran gives every newcomer, and says one sentence: "You'll learn fast, or you won't learn at all." The first days pass without a major battle, but the constant shelling does something more dangerous than any direct assault. It keeps you in a permanent state of alert that never lets up. Your body can't tell the difference between a shell landing a kilometer away and one landing beside you. Your heart pounds at the same speed either way. This is exactly what military doctors began noticing during this period, a condition they gave a strange name at first: shell shock. Historian Ben Shephard, who wrote a detailed history of this condition and how the British Army handled it, explains that doctors themselves were divided on how to interpret it. Some believed it was a physical injury to the nerves caused by shell vibrations. Others, and these were the more dangerous ones, saw it as a weakness of character, treating affected soldiers as deserters rather than victims of a real trauma. Here lies one of the cruelest ironies of that war. A soldier fights bravely for weeks, watches his comrades fall around him, then breaks down under the weight of what he's witnessed, and instead of treatment, he's accused of cowardice. His mind was simply doing what any human mind does when faced with the unbearable, trying to protect him by any means, even if from the outside that protection looked like weakness. Trench warfare wasn't the string of decisive battles you once imagined. It was long stretches of waiting, broken by short bursts of terror. A single attack could mean climbing out of the trench and running across completely open ground under machine gun fire, advancing a few meters, then retreating hours later, having lost half the men who went in with you. Why did this pattern repeat for years with so little movement in the front lines? Because the military technology of the era, the machine gun and heavy artillery, had far outpaced traditional infantry attack tactics. The result was a slow-motion massacre, repeated again and again on roughly the same stretch of ground. Everything you've seen stays with you even after the fighting pauses. You fall asleep and jolt awake at a sound that isn't there. Your hand shakes for no visible reason. Food loses its taste. These aren't signs of weakness. They're the entirely natural response of a human mind exposed to something it was never built to withstand. But in an era that didn't yet have the language to describe this condition clearly, many soldiers were left to face it alone, or punished instead of understood. Then winter arrives. The cold adds a layer of suffering just as brutal as combat itself. Fingers freeze. A condition called trench foot develops from standing too long in cold water, and if untreated in time, it can require amputation. Infectious disease spreads faster than any attack because thousands of men are living crowded together in near-total unsanitary conditions. A soldier might survive 2 major battles, then lose his life to a simple fever that would have been easily treatable in another time. And when the war finally ends in November 1918, you don't feel the elation you imagined on the day you enlisted. You feel a strange emptiness. The train home passes through the same scenery you saw on your way to the front, except now it's utterly destroyed instead of green. Your family greets you with real joy, but you quickly realize the person who came back isn't quite the one who left. You sit at the dinner table, and the sound of a dropped plate makes you flinch out of your seat. A child asks you one day what you saw in the war, and you find yourself unable to answer, not because you don't remember, but because you remember far more than you can say out loud. This isn't the story of heroism the way you imagined it on that summer evening in 1914. It's the story of how an ordinary human mind endures what it was never built to endure, and how it keeps trying to live afterward. And maybe that's the lesson that still matters today, more than a century later, when we hear about a soldier or a survivor of some disaster who comes home unable to explain to those around him what's inside him now. The distance between what we witness on a battlefield and what we can put into words is the same distance that man in the old letter tried to close with a single sentence. Please don't tell Mother what I saw here.